Welcome to the Green Jobs Media Series. My name is Jose Reyeros. I am your host, and we're going to be talking about the intersection of climate justice, regeneration, as well as urban sustainability and circular economies. Today, we have the privilege to talk with Kookai Chaimahawong, who is part of the Center for Climate and Business Solutions as a director and has a lot to share with us around availability of green jobs, the intersections of corporate sustainability and what we're seeing more as the climate movement. And we're going to be exploring the different perspectives that we get from someone with my background that has more of the social sciences and mobilization of different initiatives that require systems change, and then beginning to understand the lenses of pragmatic and scalable views that Kookai is going to be able to bring with us today. So Kookai, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Well, to get us started, I would like to ask you if you can introduce a little bit more about the center and talk not only what is going on, but at the same time, what is the impact of these programs? What are you looking to do with them? Especially, what is the role of youth in this program? And not only if they're involved with UBC, but if they are entrepreneurs or people outside of the University of British Columbia who want to get involved with it.
Absolutely. Thank you for setting me up so well. So the Center for Climate and Business Solutions was recently established at the UBC Sauder School of Business just in February this year. And when we established and launched the center, I say that the center is here to partner with businesses to meet their climate goals. And we do that through two things, because we're at the university, that is through workforce development, and I'll touch on that in just a little bit, and research, because we are a research university. On the workforce development side of things, I say that because we're at the business school, what I do is really to bring business students to work on climate related issues or opportunities is what we're calling it now. And that's not really just to launch new courses and programs and whatnot. I tend to take the approach that every job is a climate job and every business sort of areas apply to all climate issues and how we can actually work together to solve the problems. So I partner with existing courses that are teaching the fundamentals. So think things like accounting, finance, operations, marketing, all of the business disciplines. And I bring the real world climate related, issues to the classrooms. So example of how I've been able to do that is several programs I've launched earlier this year called the SME Climate Clinic. The other one is called the LC Clinic for SMEs as well. So how it works is that, I teach students, well, I don't teach the students, but the faculty members teach the students on certain subject. In the case of SME Climate Clinic is carbon accounting. So how to calculate scope 1, 2, 3, emissions of the operations. And then we pair the students with the small businesses that need the support in understanding the, again, the carbon emissions and calculations from that, because they are under the pressure from the customers and investors and so on. So this way, the students, again, the business students are trained in how to apply the business fundamentals to the areas that businesses actually need the support the most. At the same time, the SMEs, they do walk away with that actionable piece, of information, that actionable piece of reports and whatnot that the students have provided to actually meet their goals. When we first think about, working in this area, we say we want to be able to bridge what's called the intention action gap. I don't know if you've heard about this term before, but there's sort of like this intention, like we've heard the businesses doing things like committing to net zero, getting to carbon neutral, whatever that may mean for them, because the definitions are quite all over the place right now, and it's just being formalized into, what's like the global standards. And, we're trying to reduce sort of that intention action gap by getting students to support them in meeting the goals. And starting with the small businesses, I think is key for us, because small businesses do make up of 90% of all businesses globally, and they can't be afford to be left behind, as big corporations are, requesting them to do things when they don't have the resources to do so.
I'm really glad to be hearing all of these gaps that are being filled by the center. Personally, having been in geography and environmental studies across different faculties at UBC, I just graduated back in May. And for me, something when I came out to the workforce was that readiness aspect missing. And so thinking more about how these can be filled with the different business solution-oriented skills, as well as locating what is actually the work that has to be done out there when it comes to corporate sustainability. So specifically in this more pragmatic view of how we can activate these young professionals, I'd like to start a question more around non-business students and what is your advice to them? Because perhaps there can be some of the gaps that you're filling out in those skills that can be transferable into those faculties, and see how we can create more bonds between these different fields of study.
I love this question and thank you for asking that. But the programs are running right now. I mentioned to you we have two programs and I have lots of plans for next year. But the two programs are running right now. Half of the students participating in the program are actually from non-solder, so non-business students that are participating in it. And I do actually see prime opportunities to bring business students with non-business students, from all over the campus to be working together. Because at the end of the day, yes, business can be sort of the vehicles, you know what I mean, to help solve the issues, whether that's creating the business case, creating the change and, implementing the solutions. But that's not everything. We do need that diversity of thoughts. Just example, another program that I mentioned that we launched is the LCA Clinic for SMEs. So this program, I actually bring in a faculty member from forestry to teach students because we're at the business school, I do want business students to participate on creating calculating life cycle assessments, which is very key, right? LCA is almost like the fundamentals of all, if you think about a circular economy principle from, taking the materials all the way through to processing it and where to discard it in the end. And so, LCA is quite complicated in nature and typically it's outside of, the business domain. But, we launched this program, we promoted across the campus. Half of the students participating in the programs are also from none outside of solder, but we do see the beauty in that because we mash the students up together to be working with quite technical businesses that are trying to launch sustainable alternatives, right? You think, whether that's bio-based solutions and so on, and they come together to think about, okay, there's a technical side of things where students from outside of solder is able to bring from biology from other parts of the campus, and there's a business students that are really gelling it together, if you know what I mean, to create sort of this business opportunities to help the businesses in understanding how they can use the LCA as they receive the information, because it is quite complicated and if you just have the numbers and you can't tell the stories, then it's harder to get implemented. And so we're seeing the magic happens when students group come together of various backgrounds. And that's actually my favorite part too of working with the students.
Yeah, particularly I think that the opportunity for that interdisciplinary collaboration with the students is super important, especially in programs I'm sure that you've encountered, but global resource systems, geography, earth and ocean sciences, because sometimes the science can be very precise, but then the applications are very ambiguous. So especially in that sense, I think that right now we have a lot of people who have graduated from these social science degrees. They're frankly lost. And I'm telling you this more from testimony, considering my path on, already 7-8 months of work search and then trying different things out. And then hearing from other peers who have graduated 1 year or 2 years ago. And then the reality of jobs is that I am finding that the university prepares you with a very different set of skills than the one that is out there for you sometimes. And in this sense, I sense a lot of loss in terms of how have these years prepared me for something that's not out there in the job sector. And I remember seeing a LinkedIn post from the center talking about scanning the job market. And for me, it was a little bit confusing because it dissociates a lot with what the experience has been, not only for me, but for my network, where through this podcast, I'm trying to see how we can gather perspectives and be better prepared for those jobs out there. So I guess with this, do you have any perspectives on what I'm telling you? Perhaps is it an issue of looking in the wrong places, or perhaps do I need to market myself a little bit different? This is directly advice for people out there who are lost in their job search.
To be honest, I also feel that it's not your fault or the university's faults per se. It's just things are happening so fast right now in the world. So when I graduated, right, you think about corporate responsibility and things like that. We were still at the stage when I graduated, just CSR. If you recall CSR, corporate social responsibility, basically, you go into the firm and you think about how companies can give back, to the world. And a lot of the CSR type, initiatives are pretty much disassociated from the operations of the organizations, right? So you think about okay, you can help the companies come up with the campaigns like planting trees, or in the case where I'm from, which is Thailand, originally developing regions, they always love building schools. And I never understand why, because they would go go build the schools, and then there's no teachers, right? Like, it's just the school, it's just the facade of that. And they take the photos and it's always in the newspaper. So that was kind of like the job kind of type, right? For those that graduated way back in my time that wanted to be in corporate responsibility. And then fast forward to today, so much is happening in the world. We're talking about energy transition, we're talking about systems change, we're talking about circular economy concepts, principles that, just reinventing the way we do things, from scratch. And that is not just, youth getting into the workforce. It's also people that are already in the workforce as well, that's trying to like make sense of what they can do, and what they should do. And I know this because I do teach, in executive education as well, like people that are already in the workforce that are trying to up skills and understand what are the lingos, like the ESG and the impact, and all the new acronyms we call the alphabet soup of ESG essentially means for their roles. So going back to sort of like my advice for young people going into the workforce is it's you have to understand that the world is changing so fast, and a lot of that is to do with like the world also doesn't know where it's going as well. So you're coming into this time where you have to really like adapt to the changing world much more than before. So I would say like try to read lots of news. That's what people do as well that are already in the industry. They're trying to follow the trends that are ever changing, but I think the key is to look a few years out in the future. Like today, the conversation we're probably having it like right now, right? But then in the 5 years time, 10 years time, we're probably talking about something else that's more urgent and more demanding. So how do you like get ready for what's to come? So that would be my advice. And have you seen the diagrams as well? Like it's like the three circles coming together on what you're good at, what the world needs, and what you love. And I think at the end of the day, I mean, I've changed several jobs and roles in my life, but I always stick to what I love to do and trying to align like developing my skills with what the world needs. And so if you can find that sort of like the thing that intersects in the middle, then you'll be primed for the opportunities in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's something I've talked a lot with mentors is that generational difference, and perhaps just not consenting our expectation to just you get a job and then that's job security, but rather it's like in a moving world where, especially with climate policy and especially with climate change that is so volatile, we need to be really, really noticing what's going on. What are those trends, as you mentioned? And so I mean, it's for sure challenging, and especially as we think about the optimism of really every generation and just seeing how climate targets perhaps are falling behind. We are, already 5 years away from 2030. It seems like there's confusion around what happens next. And then after that, we see, political changes happening all the time that either scale up the solutions that we need, and sometimes they just backtrack them, as we're seeing it more often now. So how are you finding more private sector to refuge you in this progress and be a powerhouse for everything that the governments and policy might not be able to keep track of? Maybe business can be that force of power that can get us somewhere when politicians are not responding, perhaps.
Yeah, I think I see businesses increasingly recognize that climate solutions is not just like a responsibility, like the corporate social responsibility that I shared with you earlier, but it's almost like the strategic business opportunity. So like we're seeing businesses stepping up in several ways that before, like you wouldn't see that in my time when I entered sort of the corporate responsibility kind of world. And we're seeing businesses integrating climate into the core business strategies, not because they're being told what to do, but because they realize this is a matter of like the longevity of the businesses in the future, that they have to be thinking about the risks, right? The climate risks that are impacting their operations. They have to be thinking about what we call in business world, the transition risk. As consumers are changing their preference, as the world is moving into the low carbon economy, what is the business doing to ensure that they're not going to be stuck with things like stranded assets because they invested in things that are no longer, like going to be in the future, or not aligned with the low carbon economy. So we're seeing, businesses stepping up in several ways. I know it's not enough, but the movement is here. And, part of the movement that I'm seeing as well, it's, I work in the business school and I work in business. And a lot of people always ask me like, how do you get business to act? And at the end of the day, I always say it's the carrots and sticks, right? Because who are the business? Like, who are businesses? Like, it's basically, an entity formed by individuals that make up it. And is it a person? Is it going to wake up one day and say, let me clean up the river that I've been polluting, or let me give more to my employees because I woke up today and I just feel like I want to give more. That's not how it works. And so you need to have sort of this environment where there are carrots and sticks, and a lot of people point to the policies and the regulations. Of course, that's sort of like the areas where you can make the most impact, which is providing incentives, or providing the sticks, creating that regulations and things like that. But I think the carrots and sticks that people don't talk about enough are the stakeholders. So we're actually shifting into the world where stakeholders, for me, have more power than ever before. In business, again, we teach about shareholder capitalism, whereas before businesses would do everything to give, the return to the shareholders because that's what they're set up to do. And now we're shifting into the stakeholder capitalism, where the stakeholders, employees, consumers, of course, and those that are, being impacted by the business actually have the influence over the outcomes of the businesses. You think about the young people in the new generation, as you enter the workforce, you bring the values with them. You have the willingness to change and challenge the status quo. You also become a big consumer groups as well in the future, that you're demanding more of the action, from corporations to be more responsible towards, what they are selling and what they're selling and all of that, right? And so, the stakeholders are becoming key, sort of shaping that decisions and driving change. So we're seeing that a lot more. That also is a little bit tied to what we're seeing with ESG as well, which we can touch on a little bit later too. But really change everything, and companies no longer just focus on the financial performance. They now want to pay attention to stakeholders because they know that the stakeholders also will in turn impact the financial performances. It's not just the numbers and the bottom lines of the numbers only, but how well they're taking care of their stakeholders. So I think this trend and this power that is shifting towards the people are going to drive businesses to actually see climate solutions as strategic opportunities, and not just let me do something nice today because I have the spare change and whatnot.
I really enjoy how you are able to frame these more business concepts and perspectives on how you understand the green transition and finding more the role of business in climate, and to reconcile some of these ideas with some of the lenses that people have in the climate advocacy, climate justice organizing, and more the activism space. First, I'd like to introduce a question for you to just set the space. What has been your experience with climate organizing in Vancouver, in Coast Salish, and perhaps more with organizations that focus more on land-based solutions, indigenous reconciliation, and more of the community organizing level of things?
I would say, so before I transitioned into, my current role, to run the Climate Center, I really focused my efforts around creating the movement called the Impact Investing Movement. So impact investing, maybe if we take sort of a time machine back into the history of how it all comes together, right? I actually, started my career launching a social enterprise in Thailand before I went to work for the UN and before I transitioned to my role into investing in climate solutions. But we think about what's happening in the world right now of impact investing and the movement that is thinking about allocating capital to something that's place-based solutions. Something that is benefiting, the stakeholders again, or the community. That's something that didn't really exist before. Because when you talked about that before, people would always think this kind of investment approach is very niche. It's social entrepreneurship. It's very niche. It's very much just groups of people. And I definitely felt at the time when I was, working in social enterprise and so on, that I was it's always constant uphill battle, right? Trying to convince that this is a business that makes sense. Now, when I came to Vancouver, I got to be a part of an investment, community. And at the time, the investment community just woke up to the fact that hey, wait, by making impact, we can actually, achieve good financial outcomes from that as well. And hey, perhaps maybe we should think about, the way we invest. That is not just for short-term gains, investing today and tomorrow you see I don't know, like the return, like Bitcoin and so on. But you actually, are investing in something that's long term, right? It's called long termism. This is the term that we use a lot in investing, and trying to push the notion that, return doesn't have to be just like the big return outcome, the unicorn right away, but it can be something that's, like sustainable going forward in the future, and you're not just cashing out after you make the investments. And so we're seeing this shift, and this shift comes with also paying attention to the impact businesses. And impact businesses, honestly, like I've spent, again, personally, launching one, running one, but also like, just my time in Vancouver supporting various impact businesses that are really trying to also share with investors and others that, like, by doing good, it means successful business outcomes. By me running certain businesses that are supporting, areas that are critical for the world, like climate, this is good business. And, the dollars that are being paid attention into, like sort of this area, I think this is really awesome. Like, just in a few years ago, like impact investing reached like $1 trillion, which is quite significant to ever before. It's now becoming mainstream. So you look at venture capital nowadays, like the venture capital funds, they all have impact metrics that are tied to it. It's not just saying that, like, I want to invest in a unicorn, money, next return. It's now, like a lot of the funds are now tying their impact, the impact outcomes. They like to see things like, we'd like to see the potential of carbon dioxide removed from the atmosphere. We like to see the health impacted. We like to see underserved communities, being supported through the investments as part of something to screen, the investment criteria, which is never heard of before. And I think this is only going to accelerate. And sorry, just to touch on a little bit as well. So when I worked at the UN, I worked in the department called the United Nations Development Program, UNDP. And UNDP, it's been sort of like largely responsible for like looking at the sustainable development goals. And at the time, before I worked on the SDGs, I was working on the Millennial Development Goals, which was before the SDGs. Before the SDGs, we had the 10 sets of goals, right, that the world like to see. But it's very much largely focused on public sectors, right? Governments around the world committing to the 10 goals. It's your responsibility as government to ensure there's no poverty. It's your responsibility as a government to ensure, like, climate or zero hungers and whatnot. And, at the time, I remember having this conversation within the UN department and saying that, like, it's just so hard to try to allocate the capital, especially from developing regions, to solve these critical areas, because they have to be investing in infrastructure and other things first. And so when we launched the SDG goals, we say the SDGs need to be the goals where the private sector and the public needs to understand why we need to achieve the goals together more. And so this SDGs, I'm going back to my impact investing point here, is that the SDGs become this overarching themes of saying that, like, well, private businesses, the private sector, you also can have the responsibility, you also have the opportunity to tackle the goals as part of your business as well. So I think this is the shift that the convergence, I used to say the convergence of what I did before I came to Vancouver, and that my time here has come together and blended so well to show that the strategic opportunities in the space.
That's lovely. I think that I see that some reconciliation between that scalability, and I begin to see a little bit of what your theory of change may be regarding how business and the private sector takes place in taking action for the green transition. And within that, I wonder, how would you respond to more of the climate activism and advocacy side that, whose whole narrative is around the lack of action and the too little, too late, or perhaps thinking more about not only the stakeholder action and the responsibility, but really the shareholders and the 1% and the CEOs. And we're seeing this hatred for the business leadership at the top. And for me, something that I always think is, while I resonate with some of those feelings, I also think, okay, there is a complexity in such a globalized economy, in such a complicated market, and all of the different factors that come into how the world works and what we need for this energy transition and for this transition risk to be understood at all levels. So how will you respond to those heated and emotional perspectives that are taking over a lot of the progressive left climate movement?
Maybe I should also address as well that I feel it too. Even though it's just sort of like I work at a business school and, I work with businesses, but I feel it as well, the emotional response side of things, especially, the news you're seeing in the world, right? And how people talk about climate action in a way that is not aligned with your values. Especially I'm referring to the recent US election as well. Like, would be honest with you that I also felt defeated as well when I heard the news about the outcomes of the election and, what's going to happen. Like, I was quite down for a few days actually. And I think, I was even talking to so many of those that work in sustainability within like corporates and whatnot, that it almost feels like we've been taking steps forward, right? Like 2 steps forward. Now we're taking 3 steps backwards because of what just happened. The reality is, when you want to see the results, right? When you want to see like climate action, climate solutions being implemented, it requires a system change. And the systems change is so difficult because it requires this coordination, across all sectors, organizations, whatever it may be, the public and the private sector, the civic organizations, the businesses and so on. It requires everyone to agree on the common sets of goals, set the differences aside, and then tackle the goals together because, if one of those components is not being in place, right, then we're not going to achieve it. If the policy, is not there to support, creating this enabling environment is what I always call for businesses to do things, then that's not going to happen. If the businesses were to, walk back on their commitments and whatnot with no guardrails from organizations like, whether that's, climate activists and whatnot that are trying to hold them accountable, then, that's not going to happen. So it almost like, how do we agree on the common sets of goals and then we go there together? And that is so difficult. I always viewed my careers as almost like, every job that I've had so far in my life, I entered it because I was curious about how I use it as a platform to enacting change, whether that's social and entrepreneurship to, the UN, to investment, to now my role at the university. And I've always thought of it as like this platform, like I need to, I want to be able to see change, from it. And what I've learned along the way is that initially in my earlier years, I felt like I was always work against businesses. And, for me, my personal learnings was that it just felt like an uphill battle. So afterwards, when I actually decided to do my master's at UBC, my initial thesis at the time was actually, well, I felt like a Robin Hood robbing corporations, so I should just learn how to rob them better. And that's what I used to tell everyone all the time, that I just wanted to learn how to change, the business and the systems in which the businesses are part of, because that's how I want to see the scale of the impact and the change that it has. And I've come to the conclusion now, and perhaps, things may change in the future as well, because I feel like it's a journey for all of us, right? To think about how do I be part of that change. And right now, I feel like I have almost like the responsibility to show young people and to show the business leaders as well that like being a part of climate solutions and, embedding it across your operations, is a strategic opportunities. It's opportunities, not just risks. Because, I spent also a number of years as well speaking to businesses and saying that climate risks are going to be, so bad, and you have to be thinking about climate risks and coming from that risk perspectives. And then I also learned as well that like risk is something that happens in the future no one really cares about because it's not something that they can measure today. And so now I'm really trying to think about creating the movement where, this is a business opportunities. And one thing that is really important this year, 2024, we're towards the end now, is the biggest election year in history, right? 150 countries heading to the poll. When I first established the center in February, I was actually quite scared of this because I felt it that the movement was going to swing the other way. The other way meaning that climate, being the top of mind, number one concern for most people is being replaced with affordability. Right? And so I felt at the time launching the Climate Center that like, okay, this is the time now or never that I have to be pushing this movement, because otherwise then, if we're not putting climate in the same bucket as, affordability or securing our future, then that's going to be something that's going to be very difficult going forward. An excellent example that I've been saying about how do we create this durable climate policy As you look at the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, is $500 billion of this, largest piece of legislation in history, right? Going towards, clean and climate initiatives. So that is clean energy projects and so on. And the IRA, when the Biden administration first launched it, it's almost like the carrots, if you think about it, when I talked about the carrots and sticks in making businesses act. The IRA is pretty much like the carrots, right? It's the tax breaks, it's the incentives to get people to invest in clean energy. When the IRA now, with Trump administration coming up next year to say that he will either dilute down or struck down completely, the IRA, and the spending in which the Biden administration has promised. Now he's actually being met with resistance from the Republican states because the flow of capital of the IRAs have actually gone into the Republican states more, because the IRA has shown that, hey, by you small farmers adopting solar panels at your farm and installing it at your farms, you can actually get, the tax credits from this, and it's been installed. And most of the people that are benefiting from this piece of legislation are actually from the states where they are trying to ban the word like climate change, where they're trying to, ban the words, they have already banned the words like ESG, for example, and saying that investors should never, ever use the word ESG or climate as a way to look for investments, ever. But they're actually the ones that are benefiting, the most from the Inflation Reduction Act. And so this is one of the things where, I'm coming to the conclusion, and hopefully next year we'll also see this as a result as well, that the IRA is not peeled back as much as he said that he was going to do, because we're already seeing the benefits of that. So moving away climate from this ideology, something that is personally, very emotional for me as well, to something that is like, okay, there is a business fundamentals and the values to be having in us implementing the solutions. This is my hypothesis for now, that this is the way to go.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that. I mean, it's quite interconnected with the Canadian economy, so I imagine that it's going to have similar outcomes as we see transition, because looking more and more like that, we have a conservative government showing up, and, exit tax and all that campaign is clicking with people, and affordability is becoming that very present priority for the population. So I think as we close down with this podcast, I'd like to come back to young people, and perhaps if you have any advice for young people who are trying to communicate that transition risk with the people that they work with in large organizations, or perhaps if you have any perspectives for youth who, they are not shareholders, they don't have the capital, they're just young people with talent and with the right values. What can you tell them as they enter the green workforce?
I wish, we have more time for me to kind of express not just maybe pause and say that I was once sort of the youth, I guess the young people, was a part of many movements, organizations that are trying to really create change, right? And I used to actually hate it when the adults of the world, when I was young at the time, would say oh, you're the future, you are going to solve, you are going to make big change. And I used to hate it at the time, because I feel why make it, sort of my responsibility, why make it so that there's so much pressure, for me to actually having to do something when you also need to be fixing things as well. So I used to feel that way, but I think the reality is today, the movement is here, the momentum is here. I think if you find organizations that are aligned with your values, that's where you can shine. But, it's not just, only looking for the organizations that speak your language and so on. I think you need to be thinking about the roles in which you can create change, most effectively. So looking at, again, the diagrams that I mentioned, looking at your backgrounds, looking at the skills that you can bring to said organizations, and think about how do you actually use that as a platform. I've always viewed my careers as platforms. It's not something that I said is constant. I'm not going to be, I never thought that I would be in investment forever or social entrepreneurship forever and so on. I always thought of it as platforms to actually achieving, the global goals and achieving, enacting my values and so on. So I think you look for organizations that allows you to sort of bring that to the forefront, embedding your values as the skills that you bring to the organizations. And I think that's the best, learnings that you can have. I sometimes give advice to, people that in your early careers, most of the time it's not about like how much money you make, even though yes, I understand people will be caring about like the salary and so on, especially if you live in Vancouver, but a lot of the times it's about the learnings. Try to optimize, places where you can learn the most, and once you sort of get that learnings and that experience, then that allows you to think about what's next, because reality is, your job that you take right after university, it's probably not the only job that you ever have. Maybe it is, and it's good for you. But a lot of the times you are going to be, changing roles and changing organizations and so on. So try to think about, how that, plays into the learnings. I honestly think education is so critical in the time we're in right now. That's why I came back to the university as well, because, there's so much of the misconceptions and misinterpretation and the noise and the misinformation of what's happening in the world today. So how do you actually, again, think of yourself as a lifelong learner, right? To continue to explore, to continue to push the paradigms, to continue to actually get down to the bottoms of the whys. That's something to not be taken lightly, even though you graduate from the universities. It's like to always, push that boundaries, because what it means to the businesses in today's world and, in the next 10 years are gonna look very different.
I like your ending point. I think that a word that has been misconceived for a long time now is radical, and just going to the root of things and not making it something that can be a fundamentalist or trying to completely take over, but really questioning, why are we doing business? What is the interest of having this job? Am I really just making money in the short term but not really having the learning? And at the climate level, like, can I actually advocate if I don't have food on the table? I don't have a roof on my head. So I think that it applies to all of these different things that we've talked about. Thank you so much for sharing. I've personally learned a lot. I think that you threw a lot of terminology that has been super helpful, especially now that I am working and leading on a climate organization that is immigrant-based, that is youth-led, and that is trying to find the data to back our impact, the opportunities to collaborate with private sector. I think that, just uplifting the center for those programs and for that support, and personally just for that mentorship, getting it from you is really valuable. So really congratulate you on all the beautiful work being done.
Thank you for having me. I hope we have a part two in the future.